Okay, apologies for the clickbait title, but to be fair, it's not exactly inaccurate. If you are a Minecraft data pack developer and you have ever tried to use, the game's vanilla features to compute any sort of number, you will know how much of a nightmare that is. You'll probably know that we can do integer math using scoreboards, and that's a little bit clunky, but it usually works. It's possible to store pretty much any value in a scoreboard, and then if you store two of those values, you can perform basic integer operations on them. But scoreboards, of course, are limited to integers. If I try to put in a decimal number right here, scoreboards really do not like that. So for as long as I've been working with Minecraft commands at least, if you want to do math with something that's not an integer, like a decimal, you have to either change the scale of an integer and then do scoreboard math and then scale it back down when you're done. Lately, there have been people who are doing other stuff, such as using environment attributes to perform computations, which is insane person behavior. I mean, really cool insane person, but still insane. But as of today's snapshot, after all of these years, decimal math is finally a thing that you can do with data packs. I am so happy and I'm so excited to show off how exactly it works. As of these past few snapshots, Mojang has been giving a lot of attention to number providers. And in fact, one of the big changes they made a few snapshots ago was that you can now actually define number providers as their own files inside a data pack, which is super cool. And just last week, they added this new number provider type called product, which basically allows you to multiply a whole bunch of different numbers together. Now, everything that goes inside this list is going to be a number provider on its own. So this first one right here, for example, will pull an input from a storage slot that I made up, and then I'm multiplying it by, a whole bunch of digits of pi. So since they added product, well, we now have sum and product, which means we can add and multiply, and if we can do both of those things, we can subtract as well, because you could, add something that was multiplied by -1. So that's already a lot of basic arithmetic operations. We still can't do stuff like raising numbers to a power, which would, if we had that, that would be really cool. It would allow us to square things, it would allow us to take the square root, it would even allow us to divide, because we could, multiply by something to the power of -1. So if anyone from Mojang is watching this, I really just want a power number provider. That would be very cool, thank you very much. But anyway, aside from all that, the cool thing they added in this snapshot was that we can actually now take these number providers and just run a single command to have them do their thing and compute their number and return it. So before this snapshot, there were like only a few specific contexts that you can call a number provider from. Well, now it's possible with just a command, and I'm going to show you how that actually works. So first, I've got to reload so I can actually get my number provider to apply in-game, which is another really cool thing. Number providers are reloadable, which is awesome. And now that that number provider is in the game, I can run /compute, that's the new command, and these three options right here are just to give it different contexts. The one I wrote doesn't really need a context, so you can just say default, and there we go, there's my provider. It's in the game, it's example times pi. So if I just run this command, it will actually get my number provider to compute its value. Oh, and there we go, it returned 0 because it was trying to pull from a storage slot that doesn't exist. So it looks like I've just got to add that storage slot in. And there we go, I'm just going to take the storage slot, take the input field, and set it to 1. So there we go. And now if I run that number provider again, it will try to multiply 1 by pi, and you can see it actually gave me a value that looks quite a bit like pi. Now you'll notice some differences here. In my file, I have like a lot of digits of pi, and this right here is not nearly as many. And obviously I wasn't doing anything to specifically truncate it, because all I did was just multiply this number by 1. So there's actually something internal that's causing this huge truncation to happen, and I'm pretty sure that truncation is just because it's returning a float instead of a double. So basically everything you're going to get out the other side has to always be able to fit in a float. But this is still a massive improvement over only being able to do math with integers. But oh wait, look, I actually am still just doing math with integers, because it says it returned the value, this little bit of pi, and then it rounded it down to 3. Now why did it do that? Well, if you remember, this is still just a command. There is still a rule in the game that if you're trying to compute values using a command's return value, the command's return value will always be an integer. So even if the value outputted by the command is a decimal, it always has to get truncated in order to be a valid return value. So how is this any better than what we had before? Well, number providers can obviously get a lot more complicated than this, and previously if we were doing like all scoreboard math, then every single intermediate step would be truncated down to an integer before you move on to the next step. The difference with this one is that the entire process runs as a float now, and then only at the very end, when it has to be in the output of the command, is it finally truncated down to an integer. So that'll actually give you a slightly more accurate computation if you still are looking to just have integers returned. But let's say I wanted to store a value that actually was not an integer. Let's say I wanted to take this value rather than just 3 and store that somewhere. Well, thankfully, Mojang actually gave us a way to do that as well. Answer me this, or think on this for a sec before I tell you the answer. What is the only command in the game that actually can deal with doubles and floats? If you said /data, you would be correct. At least generically. There's some other commands that do very specific things with doubles and floats, but data is the only one that can like move them around generically. It turns out there's actually a new subcommand under /data. If I do data modify and then set compute, this will actually allow me to basically run the same command I ran earlier, the /compute command, but rather than just, putting it into an integer return value, it's going to put it into a saved storage slot because of the rest of this data command. So if I just run the exact same compute I did earlier, compute default and then my provider, and then go ahead and run that, it'll just say it modified the storage. So in order to see what it did, I have to actually go and look in the storage. And there's the entire storage slot. I had input 1, that's what I saved earlier, and now output is actually that float value we were looking for, and it's exactly the same one that was listed here. So yes, there we go. That's exactly what we were looking for. If you're using a number provider to perform some sort of floating point operation and you need to save it in a data storage slot or anywhere, you could like save it on an entity, for example, then data modify set compute is the way to do that. And while we're on the topic, I'll also just go ahead and show you a couple other things that /compute has available to it. So like I kind of hinted at earlier, you don't have to put default right there. You can also do like block and then, some block coordinate position, or you can do entity and then target an entity, for example. These are only relevant if you're using a type of number provider that actually relies on a context block or a context entity in order to run. The one I showed you does not. I think there are some number providers that like run a predicate or something, and obviously predicates can test blocks and entities, so that might be the primary use case for those. But I think most of the time you'll be completely fine using default like this. Another thing you can do is after the number provider, you can like put an optional scale factor right here. So like if I run that command, well, it'll still output the same floating point, but then the returned value gets multiplied by the number that I put there. I'm not sure if that's exactly how it's supposed to work, but that seems to be the way it is right now. Okay, I think that probably is how it's supposed to work because I can't put a scale factor after the data compute part, right? That doesn't seem to work. Kind of wish it did, but I guess you could also just change your number provider to include that scale factor, so it's not a huge loss. And then the last thing you can do is instead of putting a scale factor, you can also put the word integer, and that will cause the entire number provider to run in integer mode. And there you'll see it just returns 3. It doesn't actually return the big floating point. So what it's doing in integer mode is it's actually, kind of doing the thing I was hinting at earlier where it truncates every single step down to an integer as it goes, which is exactly what scoreboard math used to do, but now we can do it with one command, I guess, rather than having a bunch of scoreboard objectives everywhere, so that's pretty cool. And yeah, I know this wasn't really a lot to talk about, but this has incredibly far-reaching implications. I mean, this is an entire math system that they just added to Minecraft today. The reason there's not much to talk about is because it's so incredibly broad and generic. I already have a bunch of packs that I'm working on that I think I could make really good use of this stuff with. I just hope we get the power provider in the near future. That's all I'm saying, man. Have fun with this new system. Let me know in the comments if you do anything cool with it. I have been Conyer. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I will talk to you later, my dudes. Pi equals 3. What am I, a mechanical engineer?